Less than 24 hours after the United States Navy began blockading Iranian ports, Trump walked out of the Oval Office and told reporters something that changed the tone of everything.
We've been called this morning by the right people, the appropriate people, and they want to work a deal very badly, very badly.
He didn't say who called. He didn't say from what level of the Iranian government. He didn't specify the channel, but the message was clear. The blockade, which took effect yesterday at 10 a.m. Eastern, had produced a phone call within hours. And that phone call is now driving discussions inside the Trump administration about a potential second round of in-person talks, possibly as early as April 16th, before the ceasefire expires on April 21st. This is April 14th, 2026, day 46, and the war has shifted again. This time, not through bombs or missiles, but through the quiet power of economic strangulation. Let us break down what is actually happening, what it means, and what the most important revelation from the Islamabad wreckage tells us about how close a deal actually came. Start with the blockade itself on its first full day of operation. On Tuesday morning, ship tracking data shows little traffic entering or leaving Iranian ports. A Chinese-owned tanker called the Rich Starry, already sanctioned by the U.S., passed through the strait heading into the Gulf. A second sanctioned vessel, the Elpis, transited but then sat nearly stationary in the Gulf of Oman for several hours. A Panama-flagged tanker, the Peace Gulf, moved through heading to a UAE port. 3 ships. On a waterway that, before February 28th, saw between 130 and 160 vessels per day. The blockade is narrower than Trump initially announced. CENTCOM made clear it applies to ships entering and exiting Iranian ports, not to all traffic in the strait. Vessels traveling between non-Iranian ports are technically free to transit. That distinction has kept the blockade from being a complete energy shutoff, which would have pushed Brent crude toward $130 or higher and triggered a near-immediate recession in every import-dependent economy. But the economic signal was still sharp. U.S. crude futures surged more than 8% Monday to $104 per barrel. Brent climbed above $102. Stock futures fell. Iran's foreign ministry accused the U.S. of piracy and vowed the ports are either for everyone or for no one. Thousands of Iranians rallied in Tehran against the blockade. The IRGC warned that any foreign military vessel approaching the strait would be treated as a ceasefire violation and dealt with severely. And then Iran called Washington. The logic of what just happened is almost textbook economic coercion. You take away the revenue stream, the party that depends on that revenue, and Iran's economy is already under extraordinary strain from 45 days of war, 40% domestic inflation, and war damage estimated by Tehran at $270 billion, recalculates its resistance threshold. And somewhere in that recalculation, a phone rings in Washington. But here is the detail from the Islamabad aftermath that is getting almost no coverage, and it is the most strategically significant thing said by anyone this week. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told reporters after the talks that the two sides had been just inches away from an Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding. An MoU, a Memorandum of Understanding, is a formal but non-binding document that lays out a framework for future negotiations. It is not a treaty. It is not a final deal. But in diplomatic practice, it is the document that makes a final deal possible, because it establishes that both parties agree on the shape of the conversation, even if they disagree on the specifics within it. Araghchi said they were inches away. U.S. officials denied that any agreement was imminent. But the gap between those two characterizations is smaller than it appears. U.S. officials denying they were close to an MoU is consistent with the administration's need to portray the Islamabad outcome as Iran's failure rather than a mutual impasse. And Araghchi saying they were inches away is consistent with Iran's need to demonstrate to its domestic audience that it fought hard before the next round. Both things can be true simultaneously. The talks were substantively further along than the public framing suggested, and they still broke down on the nuclear enrichment question in a way that no amount of incremental progress had resolved. What the MoU disclosure tells us is that the Islamabad talks were not a first handshake. They were a negotiation that got within touching distance of a framework document before collapsing. That is a very different situation from a cold diplomatic failure. It means the raw material of an agreement exists. The question is whether the blockade pressure, combined with the April 21st ceasefire expiry, produces enough urgency on both sides to finish the last few inches. Today also brought a remarkable joint warning from three of the most influential economic institutions on the planet. The heads of the International Energy Agency, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank issued a joint statement saying, and this is significant because these three organizations rarely speak together, that there will be no quick relief for high fuel and fertilizer prices even if the Strait of Hormuz reopens. It will take time for global supplies of key commodities to move back towards their pre-conflict levels, they wrote, and fuel and fertilizer prices may remain high for a prolonged period, given the damage to infrastructure. That statement deserves careful attention. The IEA, IMF, and World Bank are not political actors. They do not issue joint warnings for theatrical effect. When they say fuel and fertilizer prices may remain elevated for a prolonged period after the strait reopens, they are telling governments and markets to price in persistent inflationary pressure, regardless of the diplomatic outcome. The damage has already been done. The spring planting season is passing without adequate fertilizer. Qatar Energy's LNG facilities will take years to fully repair. The Gulf's desalination and power infrastructure has been hit repeatedly. In plain terms, even if Trump and Iran sign something tomorrow, the grocery bill, the fuel bill, and the electricity bill do not reset to pre-war levels for months or years. That is the economic reality that both sides are operating within, and that American voters will be living with through the November midterms. The IEA report also contained one of the sharpest geopolitical reversals of the entire war. Russia's oil revenues in March were $19 billion, almost double the $9.7 billion earned in February. Moscow's crude exports rose by 320,000 barrels a day as buyers scrambled for alternative sources to replace choked-off Gulf supplies. The country that Western sanctions were supposed to be gradually strangling has doubled its oil revenue in a single month because of a war that Washington launched in the Persian Gulf. Whether that was foreseeable or not, it is now an undeniable fact on the board. The war against Iran has made Russia richer. That is a sentence that belongs in every strategic assessment of what this conflict has actually produced. The diplomatic picture today is more active than the blockade announcement suggests. Trump said Iran called. Pakistan has offered to host a second round of talks. Officials in the U.S. and the region are privately working timelines for an in-person meeting before April 21st. Both the U.S. and Iran have acknowledged continued engagement. And Vance, departing Islamabad on Sunday, said explicitly that there really is a grand deal to be had here, but it's up to the Iranians to take the next step. That is not the language of a man who considers negotiations over. The enrichment question remains the wall. U.S. officials confirmed to Time that the talks collapsed on 4 specific red lines: an end to all uranium enrichment, the dismantling of all major enrichment facilities, allowing the U.S. to retrieve Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile, estimated by the Times of Israel as enough material for 11 nuclear bombs, and ending funding for allied militant groups. Iran would not agree to any of those. And Iran's position on enrichment is structural. It is not a bargaining chip, but a sovereign right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty's Article 4, which explicitly permits peaceful nuclear energy programs. The gap is real. But the situation contains one variable that was not present in any prior round of negotiations: the ceasefire clock. April 21st is not a symbolic deadline. It is the point at which, if nothing has been agreed, the legal architecture of the pause expires, and both sides revert to wartime posture. Nobody in Washington, Tehran, Islamabad, Beijing, or Brussels wants that. Not the U.S. military, which knows its munition stocks are depleted. Not Iran, which knows its economy cannot absorb another round of sustained bombing. Not the Gulf states, whose oil infrastructure and water supplies have been struck repeatedly. And not the global economy, which the IEA, IMF, and World Bank have now formally warned is already scarred in ways that a simple ceasefire cannot heal. That convergence of interests is the most realistic engine of a deal. Not goodwill, not trust, not shared values. The simple calculation that continuing costs more than compromising. There is one more development today that belongs on this board: the Israel-Lebanon talks beginning in Washington this morning. For the first time in more than 40 years, Israeli and Lebanese diplomats are sitting in the same room at the U.S. State Department. Israel is represented by its ambassador, Yechiel Leiter, Lebanon by its ambassador, Nada Hamadeh. Netanyahu has outlined two conditions: the disarmament of Hezbollah and a formal peace agreement with Lebanon. Lebanon has demanded a ceasefire as a precondition. Hezbollah's Secretary General, Naim Qassem, has already rejected the talks outright, saying Hezbollah will not participate. That last detail is the structural obstacle. Lebanon's government does not control Hezbollah. The Lebanese state and the Hezbollah military apparatus are two overlapping but distinct entities. Israel can negotiate a peace agreement with the Lebanese government until the end of time. If Hezbollah is not party to it and does not agree to disarm, the agreement is a document with no enforcement mechanism. Israel knows this. Lebanon knows this. Washington knows this. What the talks represent is not a path to peace in Lebanon. They represent the diplomatic theater that allows the U.S.-Iran ceasefire to survive the Lebanon question for another few days. If the talks are visibly proceeding, Iran has less justification to collapse the ceasefire on the grounds that Israel is conducting unchecked aggression in Lebanon. The talks buy time, and right now, time is the most valuable commodity on the board. So where are we, really, on the morning of April 14th? A blockade is in effect, and a phone call happened within hours. The ceasefire expires in 7 days. A second round of talks is being discussed for as early as Thursday. The three most powerful economic institutions in the world have warned that the damage is already baked in, regardless of outcome. Russia is getting rich. Iran says it was inches from an MoU, and Israel is in a room with Lebanon for the first time in 4 decades. The single most important sentence today came not from Trump, not from Araghchi, not from Vance, but from Vance himself in a different context. Talking about the enrichment question, he said the two sides had moved in our direction, but not far enough.
That phrase, moved in our direction, is the disclosure that the Islamabad talks produced actual movement on the nuclear question, even if not enough. That is not nothing. In 47 years of adversarial silence, movement in any direction is a data point. The question is whether the blockade, the ceasefire countdown, and the next phone call produce additional movement to close the inches that Araghchi described. 7 days. The board is in motion. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps more people find the board. We will be back tomorrow.